Today on the John Ankerberg Show, where did we come from? How did we get here? What brought us into existence? In most high schools and colleges, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is presented as an established fact of science rather than a theory. But today, many leading scientists in their peer-reviewed literature are rejecting Darwin's theory for many reasons. One of the most important being the Cambrian explosion of animals, where complex, fully formed animals suddenly just appeared in the fossil record, with no prior ancestors before them. Why do some scientists believe that these animals present compelling evidence of an all-powerful designing intelligence in the history of life? My guest today is Dr. Stephen Meyer, who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University, as the author of the best-selling book, Darwin's Doubt. We invite you to join us. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg. Thanks for joining me. Our topic is, why are many scientists today rejecting the standard textbook theory of evolution, known as neo-Darwinism, that we all learn in high school and college textbooks? And where do the problems with contemporary evolutionary theory begin? Well, in the next several weeks, we're going to take a fresh look at the theory of evolution and the scientific problems confronting it with scientist and philosopher Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a former geophysicist who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. And he's written two best-selling books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. In Darwin's Doubt, Dr. Meyer tells how Darwin himself doubted the ability of his own theory to explain a crucial piece of evidence, and how that doubt has grown up to create a major crisis in evolutionary thinking today. Darwin was troubled by a major event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, in which the first major groups of animals appeared abruptly in the fossil record. Dr. Meyer, we're glad that you're here. And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which will give you an idea of just how sudden the Cambrian explosion of animals on the earth was. I want you to watch.
According to standard estimates, almost 90% of the Earth's history took place during the Precambrian geological period. While our knowledge of the Precambrian is far from comprehensive, most textbook accounts include a similar chronology and chain of events. About 3.5 billion years ago, primitive life first appeared on Earth in the form of single-celled bacteria. Over time, these cells gathered into clusters to form blue-green algae that floated on the surface of the oceans. Life changed very little for more than 3 billion years. Then on the threshold of the Cambrian period, evidence of multicelled organisms first appears in the fossil record. There is also evidence that near the end of the Precambrian, the oceans were inhabited by jellyfish, sponges, and the mysterious Ediacaran fauna.
But if you go to immediately before the Cambrian, then actually you find something extremely puzzling, because you get large organisms, large fossils, and these are called the Ediacaran assemblages, and they have been one of the great headaches for paleobiology and also for evolutionary biology. Why? Well, because basically some look like animals, but other ones don't look like animals at all.
Some of them look like air mattresses, quilted air mattresses. Others look like a frond. They're not plants, but they kind of have that appearance.
Whether the Ediacarans were actually animals or plants is still uncertain. But late in the Precambrian, they disappeared from the Earth. Then, long after their extinction, everything changed in a geological instant. a spectacular burst of creativity, the basic blueprints for most of the animal kingdom exploded into being. And for the first time, biologically complex structures like compound eyes, spinal cords, articulated limbs, and skeletons appeared on Earth. To understand the speed of the Cambrian explosion, imagine the history of life compressed into a single day.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
Since Darwin, excavations on every continent have revealed the magnitude of the explosion of life, an event that was clearly global in scope.
You know, Stephen, what we just watched is astonishing, all right? Why is the explosion of animal fossils on Earth in the Cambrian time period such a challenge to Darwin's theory of how life originated?
The abrupt appearance of animal life in the Cambrian period is really surprising for a couple of reasons. First, it takes such a small percentage of the total of geological history. There's so much innovation that takes place in such a small fraction of time that that's really unexpected. You'd expect on a Darwinian basis that you'd have the mechanism of natural selection, random mutation, gradually producing little incremental changes, and there'd be a kind of a steady increase in complexity over time. But instead we see a very discontinuous or discrete increase, and that increase is confined to a very small percentage of geologic time. Now we might be tempted to think, well, yeah, but still that's the Cambrian explosion is roughly a 10 million year event. That's a lot of time. It's certainly a lot of time on the scale of human history. But what I think few of us realize or recognize is that that 10 million years is actually a blink of an eye biologically as well. It's a small amount of time in relation to the amount of time that the mutation natural selection mechanism needs to work. There's a branch of evolutionary theory known as population genetics, and it's a very mathematical branch of biology in which biologists are able to calculate what they call waiting times. This is the amount of time that you would expect for a given evolutionary change to take place. And biologists can make these calculations if they know something about the mutation rate, the generation time, the size of the populations of the different organisms that are involved. And recent calculations that have been made in the field of population genetics are showing that if you need more than a few coordinated mutations, the waiting times blow up beyond hundreds of millions of years. And so a 10 million year window is a blink of the eye biologically. It's not enough time even to generate a few coordinated mutations, let alone the origin of these extraordinarily complex animals. Trilobites, for example, had compound eyes that actually can be seen in the fossil remains of these animals. These are exquisitely complex forms of visual apparatus that are preserved in the fossil record, and they arise, again, very abruptly and within this 5 million year window. And this is really just not nearly enough time for natural selection mutation to do its work. So it's very surprising and a big challenge to the creative power of the natural selection mechanism.
Yeah, and the mystery only gets deeper as new discoveries are coming in. And we're going to take them in this next clip to China, where just an incredible discovery was found. And what's incredible about this, folks, is that they found older fossils, and they found that these older fossils were more anatomically complex. I want you to watch this clip.
Most recently, several discoveries in southern China have fascinated science and deepened the Cambrian mystery. In 1984, one of the most important finds in the history of paleontology was made outside a small town in China's Yunnan province. While surveying this mountain near Zhenjiang, Ho Sien Guan unearthed Cambrian fossils older, more diverse, and better preserved than any ever discovered. The condition of the Zhenjiang fossils was so remarkable, Ho said, it appeared as if the animals were alive on the wet surface of the mudstone.
The fossils they've collected, I mean, first of all, they're stunning. I mean, they're really beautiful to look at.
They're brightly colored, stained with iron and probably other kinds of minerals, so they're kind of golden looking or kind of reddish, and they really stand out from the rather tan colored background of the rocks, and they're just beautiful. So aesthetically, they're wonderful.
Many of them are soft-bodied. No hard parts, no skeletons, no shells, just soft-bodied, and yet they're exquisitely preserved. So you can see the Cambrian explosion in greater detail than you can anywhere else in the world.
In the early 1990s, reports of the Chinese fossils were released to the rest of the world. At the University of San Francisco, marine biologist Paul Chien followed the news.
What drew my attention was, in fact, a couple articles published in People's Daily, the official paper from the Communist Party in China, announced that the Zhenjiang fossils drew the attention of scientists worldwide. People's Daily reported that this find actually challenges the theory of Darwin's evolution.
Since 1996, Paul Chien has made several trips to southern China to conduct his own investigations.
The Cambrian explosion does challenge the traditional idea of gradual evolution of animals because they all seem to appear all of a sudden, and the problem is, how do we explain it?
Paleontologists have determined that the Chinese fossils were older than those excavated at the Burgess Shale. Yet anatomically, they were often even more complex. This discovery also confirmed that previous estimates of an explosion lasting 20 to 40 million years were much too long.
The time period that we figured it took the animals to be established in the ocean in those days took probably 10 million, 5 million years. So this is truly an explosive event in the scientific terms. What we are seeing is a quantum jump, and this quantum jump has no explanation.
As the interval of the Cambrian explosion is compressed, in other words, as the time available shrinks, the challenge to evolutionary theory grows, because the differences in form that have to be constructed very rapidly are much more dramatic. It's going to pose a real, and I think fundamental challenge to evolutionary mechanisms.
From what I saw, the Chinese scientific community as a whole seemed to be rather progressive around this. They are convinced by the evidence that the Cambrian explosion is real. And they see it's a challenge to the Darwinian theory. They are honest about it. Therefore, they are thinking about how to explain this outside of the Darwinian thoughts.
Now, Dr. Meyer, this stuff is amazing, okay? And given how quickly these complex animals arose and the absence of prior ancestors, how have the neo-Darwinian paleontologists attempted to explain the missing Precambrian ancestral fossils?
Well, as Dr. Chen alluded to, there are many paleontologists now who are acknowledging that the Cambrian explosion is a real event and that it does pose a challenge to the textbook theory of evolution that we all learn called neo-Darwinism. But there are still defenders of neo-Darwinism out there, and what they have typically proposed to explain away the absence of these ancestral forms is something called the artifact hypothesis. And what the artifact hypothesis is a kind of modified version of the idea that Darwin put forward in the 19th century, that we're not seeing the ancestral forms either because we haven't looked hard enough, or because for some reason these ancestral forms were not preserved. So the technical way of referring to that is the idea that the missing ancestral animals to the Cambrian animals that arise later, those ancestors are missing, and they're missing as an artifact of either incomplete sampling of the fossil record or as a result of incomplete preservation. Now, 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, and given all these different fossil finds, no one really can say we haven't looked hard enough anymore. So what people are now saying is that the fossils are missing because of incomplete preservation. And in particular, the idea that's put forward is that the missing ancestors weren't preserved because they were either too small or too soft to have been preserved. And that's the version of the artifact hypothesis that's still in currency. And yet there's been another discovery in China that has really challenged that idea. In fact, I think challenged it in a very fundamental way.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to go to next in this next clip, folks. What fossil evidence refutes the artifact hypothesis that the reason the missing links, the prior ancestors of the Cambrian animals, have not been found is because they were too soft and too small to have been preserved? I want you to watch this next clip.
The Xinjiang fossils provide the most inclusive picture of the Cambrian explosion yet documented. And directly beneath them, in Precambrian shales, another chapter in the history of life is written in the rocks.
There's another amazing find that's been made in China. Paleobiologists have discovered little tiny microscopic sponge embryos in the layers of rock just beneath the layer that documents the Cambrian explosion.
These embryos were soft-bodied animals. Some fossilized 60 million years before the Cambrian explosion.
They're eggs and embryos, which are preserved in thin crusts of mineralized material, a phosphatic material, on ancient seafloors, which suggests that the chemistry of the seawater in those days was somewhat different than it is today, because this method of preserving fossils disappears during the Cambrian, and it's not around today. So we're lucky that we have these thin crusts with little tiny fossils in them.
This is highly significant because one of the most popular explanations for the missing Precambrian fossils is that the Precambrian animals were too soft and too small to have been preserved.
Since 1999, Paul Chien has studied fossil embryos and helped develop techniques to analyze their structure.
By treating with acid, you can actually remove the rock and isolate the embryos, and then you get a round pebble-like or sand grain-like samples. And then we look through some tiny little ones, larger ones up to 1 millimeter in size. And we found about the range between 500 and 800 micrometers. We have mostly sponge. And then I start breaking up these balls and try to start looking inside. And with the help of electron microscope, I was able to see the detailed subcell structure within these embryos.
Chien's work on these fragile remnants of Precambrian life raises an important question.
If these lower strata can preserve an embryo, if they can preserve a soft microscopic embryo, then why couldn't they have preserved the larger ancestral forms that supposedly evolved into the Cambrian animals? In other words, if you can preserve something as fragile as an embryo, why couldn't you, in the same strata of rock, preserve the immediate ancestor of a hard-shelled trilobite?
So the idea that the fossil record is too damaged to provide us with at least a general picture, that idea just doesn't wash.
Stephen, what we just saw is incredible, and I can remember when I was in school having professors tell me, yeah, the missing links are missing because they're soft-bodied, and the fact is there's no way to keep them in the fossil record. That just went down the tubes with that last clip. What are neo-Darwinian paleontologists now saying about what they're going to do?
Well, I think we should just talk about paleontologists and Cambrian paleontologists, because I think increasingly many paleontologists are not necessarily committed to neo-Darwinism because it has so many problems. They're committed to some form of evolutionary theory typically, but now many leading paleontologists, certainly in China, but also leading American paleontologists, are saying that whatever we make of the Cambrian explosion, however we attempt to explain it, we have to start from the premise that this is a real event. It's not an artifact of incomplete sampling. It's not an artifact of incomplete preservation. It's a real event, and it has to be reckoned with. And some of the leading Chinese paleontologists, J.Y. Chen has been very outspoken in making this point. There's a major book on the Cambrian explosion that came out in 2013 by Doug Irwin of the Smithsonian Institution and James Valentine, who was shown in that previous clip from the University of California, Berkeley, in which they make this same point. The Cambrian is a real event. We may not have a good explanation for it, but we've got to reckon on the event as something that really happened. It's not just something that is a kind of illusion from our not being able to see what happened in the lower strata. We now have good reason to think that the lower strata, or the depositional environment in the Precambrian, was capable of preserving even small and soft organisms, and therefore the absence of the ancestral forms of the larger organisms with hard parts should certainly have been there if those animals existed, if those precursors existed. That they weren't preserved is best explained by the supposition that they weren't there.
Yeah. What does this do to the neo-Darwinian theory?
Well, it certainly, again, challenges the neo-Darwinian picture of the history of life. The first complex forms of animal life seem to arise very abruptly, and it also challenges the idea that the neo-Darwinian mechanism was the mechanism by which these complex forms of life arose, because that mechanism requires a vast amount of time, and it should have left behind a vast number of failed experiments, if you will. It's a trial and error mechanism where you get lots of different variations arising, different mutational changes arising. So we ought to see the evidence of all those failed trials in the lower strata, and they're not there. So it raises questions both about the pattern, the picture of the history of life that Darwin proposed, but also it raises questions about whether the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is really what was at work in producing these first complex forms of animal life.
Yeah, set us up for next week, because we're going into what you really want to talk about, and that is the fact is we're getting to, in the fossil record, biologists are saying we now know a little bit about how animals are made, and that's a problem.
Well, in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I talk about two great mysteries. And the first mystery is pretty easy to comprehend. It's the mystery of the missing fossils. It's they're simply not there. What we'd expect to see in the in the lower Precambrian layers are not there. But I think there's an even deeper mystery. And that is the mystery that I call the engineering mystery. How do you build an animal? How would the evolutionary process build an animal, especially when you have such a compressed time scale? And that mystery has been made very much more acute by discoveries that have been made since Darwin's time, in particular discoveries in the field of molecular biology about the importance of information, digital codes stored in the DNA molecule, and the importance of that information to building animals. And as we've come to appreciate that building animals requires vast sections of digital information, essentially assembly instructions, the Cambrian explosion becomes an engineering problem. Where would all that information come from? How would it get built? Because we now know that you need that kind of information to build an animal.
Yeah. Now, folks, we're just starting to unscramble that for you, and it's a deep mystery, and Stephen is one of the world's best in explaining that, and we're going to attempt to show you what is needed in terms of information, genetic information of how you build an animal, and then we're going to ask the question, where did all of this information come from? We're going to start that next week. I hope you'll join us. Stay tuned for scenes from next week's program. Well, thanks for being with me today. If you enjoyed today's program and would like to watch it again, or wish to view some of our other programs and topics, just go to our free John Ankerberg Show app or watch it at our website at jashow.org. Again, you may watch any of these episodes free on our John Ankerberg Show app. You may download each episode for your personal use for only $5 an episode at our website at jashow.org. Folks, our goal is to help encourage and strengthen you in your walk with the Lord. And possibly God is speaking to you today, and you'd like to know how to become a Christian, or you'd like to pray and invite Jesus Christ to be your personal Savior. If so, just go to our website right now and click on Become a Christian, which you'll find at the top of our home page. There we will tell you how you can pray and ask the Lord Jesus Christ to be your Savior from sin, and how you can know Him and experience Him personally. We're glad that you have chosen to watch our program today, and hope to see you next week as we present another program intended to encourage and inform you as you walk with the Lord each day. Goodbye, God bless you. I'll see you next week. Show.
Can the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection and random mutation really generate new functional code? Because to build a new animal, you need new code. You need new DNA with digital information stored in those molecules. If DNA is functioning like a section of software or functioning like a section of functional text, then if we start randomly changing it, it stands to reason that we're going to degrade that information long before we generate anything fundamentally new. And there's a reason that this is true, that if you have a section of functional information-bearing text, that random changes will inevitably degrade meaning. And that is because there's a lot more ways to go wrong than there are to go right. If anyone's played Scrabble and you have a pile of letters, you know that if you just reach in and start picking the letters out at random, you're overwhelmingly more likely to get gibberish than you are to get a word. And that's actually because people have worked out the math on this. The ratio of functional words of any given length to the ratio of sequences of characters that give you gibberish is really minuscule. It's in the case of a 12-letter word, I think the ratio is 1 over 100 trillion. One word for every 100 trillion arrangements of characters that give you nothing but gibberish. So if you start with a word, or start with a section of functional genetic text or a section of computer code, and you start randomly changing it, you're overwhelmingly more likely to end up with gibberish, because most of the sequences are gibberish. And that's the problem that the engineers were concerned about at Wistar. And so this is just not a good way to think about how genetic information originated. This mechanism simply is unlikely to produce anything good in the time we have available.
Or as Murray Eden says, it's improbable. It probably couldn't happen.
It's improbable on a cosmic scale. Yeah.
God is speaking to you today. And if you would like to have someone pray with you, or you have a question you would like to ask, there's a phone number on your screen right now that you may call. Call that number, and someone will be happy to pray with you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you'll join me again at the same time next week. And to learn how to start a relationship with Jesus Christ, go to our website at jashow.org and click on Pray to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior.